Welcome to B Plus Overland, where we share with you all of the upgrades and changes we've made to our B Plus RV for full-time off-grid living and a trip down the Pan American Highway from Alaska to Argentina. Ours is a 2021 LTV Wonder rear twin bed. That's the B Plus in the back, and it's built upon a 2020 Ford Transit 350 HD cutaway van with rear dually wheels. Come check it out. I'm going to share with you the changes we've made to our B Plus RV's suspension for overlanding. And in this case, not just overlanding down the paved road of the Pan American. What I'm talking about specifically is getting off the paved roads, onto dirt roads, onto really rough tracts of land, or off of anything, just out into fields, onto the sand, through a muddy area, and doing it with confidence. So to get the desired off-road capability, we had to address 5 things. Number 1, and most important, is lift. Get the body higher off the ground. And if the axles can get up a little higher, all the better. Number 2 was shock and strut dampening. Number 3, the leaf springs in the back, dealing with the excessive amount of weight that we're going to be carrying and upgrading the leaf springs in the back. Number 4, dealing with excessive sway when it's really rocky. We didn't want the back end being out of control and throwing stuff around. So coming up with a way to deal with that. And number 5 was weight distribution, making sure that we weren't too heavy in the front, in the back, or overall. Firstly, we dealt with the lift. There were a couple of companies on the market that had lift kits for the Transit. We ended up going with Van Compass. We liked their solution. It was more than I was capable of taking on in terms of the front end installation, so we waited till we got across the United States and to Bend, Oregon, and we had an off-road suspension specialist install that for us. The kit installed in the back just consists of basically a 2-inch block. It goes on the axle, the leaf springs go on, and bigger U-clamps go on there, U-bolts, and the back ends are pretty easy to lift. The front end, where there's independent suspension, you've got steering, there's just lots of articulation, a little more complicated. Let me show you what was done up here to get our lift. So our stock springs, which I believe were black, were replaced with these blue ones. These have similar characteristics to the stock ones in terms of their performance, but they're 1.5 inches longer. So that gave us 1.5 inches of lift. Up top, where the strut attaches to the body of the van, is a plate of a special angle that helps the front end deal with the lift and the change in so many of the angles, and that gave us another 1/2 inch. So the lift kit gave us 2 inches. These Bilstein B6 struts that I installed, I'll go into those next, but one thing that helped with our lift is this cup that holds the spring is about 1/2 inch higher than the stock. So we got 2 inches from the lift, and we got another 1/2 inch from these struts, so 2.5 inches. And then if you saw my video on upgrading our tires to all-terrain and larger tires, we got 1.15 inches of lift out of the tire upgrade. So in total, the body was lifted, what does that come out to? 3.61 inches. The axles, because of the wheels, the axles came up the 1.1 inches. We add the 1.1 to the other part. That's where we get the 3.6 for the body. So the axles came up a little. The body came up almost 4 inches. That's substantial. We have almost 12 inches of clearance now, which really allows us to go down some pretty rough tracks. When it came to this installation, you got to remember that we're not in like a 150 or a 250 van. We're in a cutoff B plus. We're super heavy compared to a stock van. So it puts a lot of stress on this system. And part of what was included was this piece right here, and it was an extender, and that basically went here where the front anti-sway bar attaches to this strut. So in Alaska, we were coming off of an apron onto the main road, and it was kind of like a ditch apron, and we hit it at an angle, and it really compressed the front wheels and one's off the ground, and it put so much pressure on it that it actually it tore the plate that came with the kit apart. And it was basically the extender area that I was just showing you is where this was installed. So I called Van Compass, and we were heading north up the Dalton Highway that coming week, and they said, oh yeah, we had heard about this on the big 350s, and they're heavy, that these could rip, so we've got a new one, and it's got this extra tab welded onto it, and we'll send you a set of those overnight. They did. I went into a library parking lot, lifted the van up, and put these new ones on. No problem. Everything worked great. We got to Nicaragua like a year later, almost exact same situation, going over an apron onto a main street. Bam! Well, these reinforced things didn't rip. What happened is the tab that's part of the strut was actually, the metal tab was ripped off. I'm like, whoa. So I called and talked to them, and they're like, well, we put these on in the first place to create more clearance between the bar and the rest of all of the articulating front end suspension, because the angles change. But they're like, we talked to the engineer, just take them off and attach the anti-sway bar back to the strut the way it was stock, and you should have no problems. Well, I did have a problem because my tab was ripped off of my strut. So when we were Panama getting ready to ship to Colombia, we had some stuff done to the van, and these guys welded the tab back on, but we didn't trust the weld alone, so we took a piece of metal and we welded it here and to the bottom of the cup, and we really we just made it bulletproof. So you can see now that this tab is not installed here, and that the bar is attached directly to the tab like it was stock. We haven't had any problems, nothing's hitting, so if you got a 350 HD like us, you might think about not using the tab if you do their lift kit. So number 2 on our list was dealing with dampening, which is, that's controlled by the struts in the front and the shocks in the back. We found that the stock suspension was pretty tight on like washboards, and we were finding that we were getting fade when we were getting a deep compression, like we were going over something rough and the suspension really compressed. We got an uneven amount of dampening, and it's commonly called fade. So we moved over to the Bilstein B6s. As I mentioned, they gave us a little more on the lift, and the dampening is much better. It is noticeable the minute you start driving. In the back, we went with the Bilstein B6 shocks. There are other solutions out there from different companies that have a second chamber, compression chamber or oil chamber reservoir, and the performance on those are better. You get a better ride out of them. And they're super common on, you know, Jeeps and off-road vehicles. But the problem that we run into is we're super heavy. Our gross vehicle maximum weight is 11,000 pounds. So what we've had read on forums and people sharing their experience is when you really load them up heavily all the time with a heavy vehicle, they just don't last, and you got to rebuild them. I didn't want to have any part of that. I wanted something super reliable. I went with the simple Bilstein B6s, and we had a nice improvement in the back on the, we lost basically a lot of that fade that we were experiencing. Okay, our next upgrade had to do with enabling our suspension to deal with the amount of weight that we're carrying here. Again, we're 5.5 tons or more of weight. We're not just a 250 cargo van that we did a home build out in, and we weigh 5,000 pounds. We're 11,000 pounds. So the leaf springs in the back really weren't up for the challenge. We're full timers, we're always at max weight, and we needed to enable the suspension to deal with that amount of weight, especially since we're taking this thing off-road. So our solution was to get super springs. So it's basically what they are is they are additional leaf springs that are installed in the back. They're not, when I say super springs, a lot of people think I'm talking about sumo springs. Sumo springs, they're those squishy things that cars come with stock, or trucks do, and you can get better ones, the sumos. They're a nice solution if you're going to stay on pavement for the most of the time. They really do improve things, but for us, we needed something that was going to be engaged all the time, the leaf springs. With the sumos on this installation, what we find is with the sumo springs, there's a space, and they're not engaging until the vehicle starts to compress the suspension a bit. So for that first bit, there's no help. And then they are different size, so the more they compress, the heavier, the more return effort you get out of them. So you go from nothing to a little to something, and it was not the action we needed off-road. We wanted the extra leaf springs so that from the moment they got loaded, the additional leaf springs were helping out, and we had a nice smooth transition to deal with all the weight we're carrying. I'll go into the carriage and show you what I'm talking about. One thing, if you do go with the super springs, you need to get a good installer who's familiar with them. To put these on, you have to have a special tool from Super Springs. The guys in Bend, Oregon that put ours on for us did not have the tool. After they did our install, they ordered it. They said they almost didn't get them on, but they were able to get them on to the medium setting, which is what I wanted, because they have 3 different pens, so you can add a little, a medium amount, or a lot of extra help. We put it in the medium. We've been happy with it. Just make sure you find a mechanic who has the tool to install those. Okay, we're now under the back end, and I'm just going to orient us. So you can see we've got the Bilstein shocks in the back, a little melted up top from the exhaust heat. These are the factory installed little rubber stoppers that are similar to sumo springs. The 2-inch lift block you can see right there between the axle and the leaf springs, and that's what gave us our lift. Now before we had the lift in, you can see that the distance probably for that rubber stopper and the axle was, let's see, maybe that much before it came in contact. So if I put some sumo springs, I believe they're a little longer, there's still going to be a gap there. So we just didn't mess with it. Our axle will never touch those. The other thing you're going to see now is the super springs. So up top, you can see that there's one extra spring that runs along the factory installed leaf springs, and then there are 3 adjustment points here. Oh, I was thinking we were in the middle one. We're actually on the first one. So that's these are what we had installed in Bend, Oregon, and these are always supporting the vehicle and adding extra support. So if we found that things were feeling a little loose, or we felt like the back end was a little low, we could find somebody with the tool and we could have them compress it, and on both ends go up a notch and add a little bit more support. Okay, so next was sway. When we are off-road and the back end, which is not independent, obviously, suspension, hits some big rocks or something, the back end is going back and forth, and things are flying and things are on the floor, and and we needed to control that, but it's a trade-off. What you don't want to do is put a heavy-duty sway bar on, like replace the factory one, and then crank it way down, because when you do that, you're retarding the ability of the suspension from side to side to operate on its own. It's trying to just operate flat all the time. So you want some articulation when you're on a big, heavy road and hitting rocks, and you know, you're off-road. What you don't want is when you hit that big rock, you want the suspension to give a little bit, but when it gives to a certain point, you'd like a sway bar to kick in. And that's why we upgraded to the Hellwig extra heavy duty sway bar. What we didn't do is we didn't crank it all the way down. So we wanted the suspension for the first part to articulate, but when the body got to too much, we wanted it to come up against that big, thick, upgraded bar and to retard the rest of the movement. So what we found when we're off-road and we're rocking back and forth, since we cranked it down to the middle setting, we've got a kind of a nice give or take. The suspension works well on its own, and the sway bar doesn't kick in until things get really severe, whereas before the whole thing was just shaking back and forth because the stock bar just wasn't heavy enough to deal with that much shocking action. So again, I'm gonna show you what that looks like underneath. Okay, we're back underneath, and I wanted to show you the anti-sway bar that we installed. This thing is really thick. It is huge compared to the stock one. So you can adjust how much effect it has by moving this bolt that's attached to the strut here, and that determines how much of the load this side's experiencing that it's trying to distribute to the other side. So we've got it in the middle, and what we find is this bar doesn't start really kicking in until we get a pretty decent compression on the back, and that's when we want it to kick in to stop excessive sway. What we don't want is for it to kick in too soon and to kind of too much share the load and not have the back axle go back and forth like this. We don't want the axle to go up and down evenly when we're on a super uneven road. So we just don't want this kicking in too soon. I have been tempted to move this out one more notch. We started there, I moved here, I'm thinking about moving it back here so that this kicks in a little bit later when the suspension is under load. So the last thing we addressed was weight distribution, which wasn't really about upgrading anything. It was about knowing our weights and making sure that they're distributed in a safe way and in a way that our suspension would function well. I mentioned that we have a gross vehicle weight rating of 11,000 pounds. That's 5.5 tons. That's heavy, and we're at that weight all the time. Now that's the total weight allowance for the vehicle. The front and the rear axle actually have different ratings that when you add them up are more than the total vehicle. The front, let's see, the rear is 72.75 pounds and the front is 46.30. If you add those together, it's 11,905 pounds. The rating for the vehicle is 11,000 pounds maximum. So what you want to make sure of is if you've got it at 11,000 pounds or more, that you don't have that weight distributed beyond the capability of either the front or the back end. You don't want to take 10,000 of 11,000 pounds and put it on the back axle. It's only rated for 7,000 some pounds. It's not going to handle right, and it's not going to be safe. So multiple times as we were gearing up and making changes to the vehicle, we went to the CAT scales at the truck stop, and we paid, you drive on, and the scale is set up such that they are weighing the front wheels and the back wheels separately. You go in, you pay, they give you a printout. I put this into a spreadsheet, and I always made sure that we were not, I'm always trying to hit, not go over the maximum weight for the vehicle, but even more importantly, I'm trying to make sure that my weight is never distributed so that I have too much on the front axle or the rear axle. We've been successful with that, and we feel pretty balanced. So those are all the changes and thinking that went into making our heavy rig off-road worthy. We're going on 2 years in. We're quite happy with the performance, other than the learning curve on that front lift tab that was ripped off, but we got that figured out and fixed, and I've told you how I think you could avoid that. A little bit of advice would be always go slow. We get into places where people look at the size of our rig and they're just like, I don't even know how you got here. The trick is to go slow and pick your line. And if you're not confident about the road in front of you, stop, get out and walk it. We do it all the time. Is that stream 6 inches deep, or is it really have a drop off because I can't quite see there? Go out with a stick. Check if you got a big mud area, check it with a stick. Is it firm underneath? Is that puddle 2 inches deep, or is it 2 feet deep? If you can't see around the corner, the road's narrow, it's deteriorating, go walk it before you go up there. The other thing is, with your partner, talk out loud about turnaround points. In Latin America especially, the roads get narrow and nobody's clearing the brush and the trees. There's just not a lot of great places when you get out in the boonies to turn around. So as you're going, note them and say, hey, I think we could turn around here, and keep track of how far apart those are. If the road starts to get really bad, it might be worth just calling it and one person getting out and back. It takes some time, sure, but back it on down and get turned around. The other thing about going off-road in a big rig like this, where you could possibly have to turn around and it takes a lot of time and you got to find another spot now, is don't travel late in the day. We never drive at night, and make sure that you start your days early and you give yourself an extra hour or two of daylight for plan B, plan C, plan D. We've gone to plan D before, and that's about it.